My father's voice cut through me like shattered glass. Not just out of this house. Out of this family. You are nothing to me. Those words are carved into me as if branded with fire. I remember the exact moment. The smell of roasted turkey and honey-glazed ham filling the dining hall, the glitter of chandeliers reflecting in polished silverware, the hum of voices and crystal laughter rising above the long mahogany table. It was Thanksgiving night at the Whitmore estate, and I knew, the instant I walked in, that something was wrong. The servants moved quickly between chairs, refilling glasses, setting down steaming bowls of buttered rolls. My sister Celeste beamed from her place at the head of the table, surrounded by admirers, her every laugh landing like applause. She was the golden child, the pride of our father's legacy. My name card, once set beside hers, now sat all the way at the far end, near the cousins who still whispered about me like I was some shameful secret. A deliberate insult. I smoothed my dress with trembling hands and took my seat. Conversation flowed like wine, but it washed around me, ignoring me, as though I had already been erased. Then my father rose. Gerald Whitmore, the patriarch, the tycoon, the man whose voice had dictated my entire life. He tapped his glass with a spoon, and silence fell. His deep baritone carried across the room. Tonight, we celebrate legacy, he began, his gaze sweeping the table before settling on Celeste. To Celeste, whose brilliance continues to elevate the Whitmore name. Applause erupted. Celeste glowed, perfect in every way, Ivy League educated, engaged to a high-profile attorney, already running part of the family's investment empire. She was everything my father wanted. And then his smile cooled. His eyes shifted to me, and in an instant, the warmth in the room died. And then, there is my other daughter, he said, his voice heavy with contempt. Forks clinked against plates. Awkward coughs rippled down the line. My stomach knotted. A woman who had every opportunity at her feet, he continued, and chose to squander them. Who hops from job to job, who treats marriage like a casual experiment rather than duty. And worst of all, his lip curled. Who dares to suggest continuing the Whitmore line with a stranger's child? My chest froze. He knew. I had confided in my mother months ago, told her I was considering adoption, that biology wasn't the only path to family. She must have told him. Around me, whispers began. I forced my voice steady. You have no right. The table rattled as his fist slammed down. I have every right. His voice roared, reverberating through the chandeliers. I raised you, gave you everything, and you threw it away. You are a leech. A disgrace. Silence. My breath caught. I searched desperately for one ally, for my mother's face, for Celeste's, for anyone who might stand up for me. But there was nothing. Only pity. Only disgust. And then, the final blow. Get out, he hissed. Not just out of this house. Out of this family. You are nothing to me. The words struck harder than any physical slap. My legs shook as I rose, vision blurring, the laughter and clinking silver fading into a dull roar behind me. I walked out into the freezing Charleston night, stripped of everything I had ever been. I was no longer Eleanor Whitmore. I was nothing. 4 days afterward, I wandered like a ghost, hollowed out. Being erased by my father should have destroyed me. But I still had Lucas. My husband was my safe harbor, the only person who had ever chosen me over legacy. His family, the Monroes of Boston, carried as much weight in northern circles as the Whitmores did in the south. Yet Lucas had always been different, steady, rational, untouched by the ruthless power games of his mother's world. Surely, I thought, his family would never betray me. Surely I wouldn't lose them too. I was wrong. Evelyn Monroe didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to strike with open cruelty. Her weapons were whispers, carefully delivered in the right ears. She tilted her head with mock concern, sipping her wine. It must be so difficult for you, dear, she'd murmur sweetly. Being cast out like that. Then came the rumors, planted seeds that spread like wildfire. That I had been disowned for financial recklessness. That I was unstable, prone to outbursts. That Lucas had made a mistake marrying beneath him. Doors began to close. Friends became distant. Invitations stopped arriving. I was being erased again, this time slowly, methodically. The final blow came when I landed an interview at a prestigious communications firm. It wasn't just a job, it was proof I could stand on my own again. I signed the offer. We had a start date. And then, days before, my phone rang. The recruiter's voice was clipped. "I regret to inform you we're going in a different direction." Silence. A pause. Then, softly, "We're sorry for any inconvenience." A week later, I learned the truth. Over coffee, a friend from the firm leaned in, guilt weighing on her face. "Eleanor, it was your mother-in-law. She called HR, told them you were emotionally unstable. That hiring you would be a liability." My stomach dropped. My own husband's mother had sabotaged me. Stripped away the last chance I had to rebuild. Something inside me cracked, weeks bled into months, and my world grew smaller. Bills piled up on the counter. My inbox stayed empty, the phone silent. Every attempt at rebuilding was strangled by invisible hands that I knew belonged to Evelyn. The whispers were everywhere. Job interviews ended abruptly, the smiles of acquaintances stiffened into brittle politeness, and invitations evaporated. I was toxic. A stain. Lucas tried to shield me, to reassure me that none of it mattered, that we still had each other. But I could see the weight on his shoulders too. The tension when he returned from dinners with his family, the hesitation in his eyes when he held me at night. I knew the pressure Evelyn put on him, whispers that he could do better, that his loyalty was costing him. It felt like drowning. Every time I tried to break the surface, someone pressed me down deeper. One night, unable to sleep, I stood before the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me was a stranger. Hollowed eyes, brittle hair, a pallor that clung to my skin like smoke. My reflection whispered the question I had been avoiding. Why am I fighting so hard to belong to people who never wanted me? Why was I still desperate for my father's approval? For Evelyn's acceptance? For scraps of validation from a world that thrived on humiliating me? My fists clenched at my sides. The grief burned away, leaving only anger. If they wanted me gone, then I would do the opposite. I would become impossible to erase. That was the night I stopped being a ghost. It started innocently. Sitting at the kitchen table while Lucas slept, I opened my laptop and scrolled mindlessly through forums. A thread caught my eye, self-publishing success stories. I clicked. Dozens of writers, people with no connections, no industry insiders, had built entire empires from nothing but their words. A memory surfaced, one I had buried long ago. I was 12 years old, scribbling stories into a spiral notebook. Fantasy, mystery, anything that let me escape the suffocating weight of my family name. Gerald had found the notebook once, skimmed a page, and scoffed. "Writers don't make money. If you want to waste time on fairy tales, do it in private." He had tossed it into the trash. But now, sitting in the dim glow of my laptop, his scorn became fuel. I opened a blank document and began to type. The words poured out like blood. Every ounce of betrayal, humiliation, and rage channeled into a protagonist, a young woman cast out by her powerful family, clawing her way back from the ashes. The sentences burned onto the page, raw and unfiltered. Night after night, I wrote. I barely ate. Barely slept. My fingers ached, my back stiffened, but I didn't stop. Each keystroke was a defiance, each chapter a weapon. I wasn't just writing a book. I was building a weapon, forged from pain. I studied, too. I learned the mechanics of Kindle Direct Publishing, the secrets of algorithm-driven marketing, the patterns that made certain books explode. I devoured articles about cover design, genre tropes, and branding. Piece by piece, I constructed not just a story but an identity. Raven Montgomery. The name felt like fire on my tongue. Strong. Untouchable. A rebirth. Eleanor Whitmore was dead. Raven would rise. When I hit publish, I expected nothing. A few downloads, maybe. But the universe had other plans. At first, it was a trickle. A handful of readers, a couple of kind reviews. Then a book blogger added it to a list titled Fierce Women Who Rise from the Ashes. Sales exploded overnight. My inbox pinged with notifications, reviews poured in, and strangers on the internet devoured the story of my fictional heroine. She is me, one reviewer wrote. This book gave me strength I didn't know I had. Another, I read it in one night. Cried. Then read it again. The numbers climbed. Within 2 months, my book had broken into the top 100 of its genre. Within 6, Raven Montgomery was earning 6 figures. Nobody knew. Not Gerald. Not Evelyn. Not even Lucas. I built a literary empire in secret, hidden behind my pseudonym, fueled by the very people who had tried to bury me. And it tasted like freedom. But success wasn't enough. Not for me. Not anymore. My father's empire, the Whitmore Hotel Group, was floundering. The luxury hotel sector was bleeding, and whispers of bankruptcy trailed him like a curse. I could have walked away. Let him drown. But I didn't want survival anymore. I wanted control. Using Raven Montgomery's earnings, I began investing. Quietly. Strategically. I created layers of anonymity, shell corporations, silent partnerships, holding companies. Piece by piece, I bought shares in the Whitmore Hotel Group. Not in my name, never in Eleanor's. Raven became the shadow investor, the ghost in the boardroom. One morning, Lucas sat at the kitchen counter, flipping through the business section. "Looks like your father's in trouble," he muttered. "Whitmore Grand is barely afloat. Apparently, some anonymous firm just bought a majority stake." I sipped my coffee, heartbeat pounding. "Really?" "Yeah," he said, shrugging. "Maybe it'll save him from bankruptcy." I hid my smile behind the rim of the mug. "No. I won't save him. I'll own him. And when the time is right, I'll take everything." Eleanor Whitmore was gone. Raven Montgomery was rising. The envelope arrived on a cold March morning, thick white cardstock embossed with gold lettering, sealed with the Whitmore family crest. My hands trembled as I turned it over, running my thumb across the wax, half expecting it to vanish if I blinked. But it was real, and inside, written in my father's bold script, were the words, "The Whitmore Foundation cordially invites you to our annual charity gala. A night of elegance, philanthropy, and legacy." Legacy. The word mocked me. Gerald Whitmore, desperate to salvage his collapsing empire, was preparing his grandest performance yet, and somehow an invitation had found its way to me. Perhaps a mistake, perhaps a cruel joke, but I saw it as something else entirely, an opportunity. For months I had worked in the shadows, building my literary empire under the name Raven Montgomery, acquiring shares of his failing hotel group piece by piece. Now the gala offered the stage I had been waiting for, the chance to step into the light and show the world who I had become. I called my team. At Lumiere, Manhattan's most exclusive boutique, stylists dressed me in gowns until I found the one that felt like armor, a sleek black dress of liquid silk, cut with elegance and edged with danger, the slit daring yet precise. A makeup artist sharpened my features into something lethal. Smoky eyes, sculpted cheekbones, lips painted the color of vengeance. My hair flowed in dark waves down my back, and when I looked into the mirror, Eleanor Whitmore no longer stared back. Raven Montgomery stood in her place, untouchable, reborn, and ready to burn the Whitmore dynasty to ash. My attorney ensured every purchase was secure, my PR strategist drilled me for the inevitable questions, and when the night came, I was ready. The Versa Hotel towered above Manhattan, a temple of marble and glass, and the cameras flashed like lightning as my car pulled to the curb. Photographers leaned forward, uncertain at first, whispering to each other as I stepped out. Then recognition spread through the crowd like fire. "Is that her? I thought she was finished. What is she doing here?" I walked past them with deliberate calm, the diamonds at my throat catching every light, my gown whispering against the marble. Inside, chandeliers glowed above polished floors, champagne sparkled in crystal flutes, and New York's elite murmured about investments and power. They had no idea that the evening was about to devour one of its own. And then I saw them. My father stood at the center, holding court, a glass of wine in hand, the smile of a man still pretending nothing had changed. Beside him hovered Evelyn Monroe, Lucas's mother, pearls gleaming, eyes sharp as razors. Celeste, my perfect sister, shone at his side, radiant and untouchable as always. Gerald's smile faltered the moment his gaze landed on me. Evelyn paled. Celeste stiffened. The hum of conversation dropped like a curtain. I moved toward them, each step measured, the weight of thunder in the silence. Evelyn reached me first, her manicured nails digging into my arm as she hissed, "What are you doing here?" I peeled her fingers off one by one and smiled coolly. "I'm here as an investor," I whispered back. Panic flickered in her eyes, but she couldn't stop what had already begun. The host's voice filled the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special announcement tonight. One of our key investors has joined us, and you may already know her by name. Please welcome Raven Montgomery." A ripple of curiosity swept the hall, reporters craning their necks, executives murmuring. My father's shoulders stiffened, his grip tightening around his glass. Then I stepped forward, and the room erupted. "Raven Montgomery is Eleanor Whitmore?" Gasps, whispers, cameras flashing like a storm. Gerald's face drained of color, Evelyn's lips thinned into a line of fury, Celeste froze in disbelief. I took the microphone, steady and cold. "You called me worthless," I said, staring at my father. "You erased me. But while you dismissed me, I built something you can never take." Silence spread, taut and electric. 4 months, the Whitmore Hotel Group has been struggling, desperately seeking investors. And tonight, I own the controlling stake. Chaos erupted. Reporters shouted questions, executives whispered with greedy interest, some smirking at Gerald's downfall. Cameras captured his face, pale and stunned, Evelyn clutching Celeste like a drowning woman grasping for air. Lucas stepped forward through the crowd, his voice firm as Evelyn tried to pull him away. "I'm staying," he said, unwavering. My father finally found words, his voice hoarse with rage. "You tricked me." I smiled, the calm of someone who had already won. "No, father. I played by the rules you taught me. There was nothing he could do. Nothing any of them could do." I handed back the microphone, turned my back to the family that had erased me, and walked out of the ballroom into the New York night. Untouchable. Victorious. Finally free, the fallout began before the last champagne flute had even been cleared from the ballroom. By dawn the headlines were everywhere, splashed across newspapers, glowing on tablet screens, whispered through every corner of Manhattan's elite. Heiress disowned, returns as secret investor. Raven Montgomery exposed as Eleanor Whitmore. Daughter ousts father in stunning power shift. What had started as gasps and murmurs at the gala turned into a wildfire no one could contain. News anchors replayed the footage on a loop, my entrance, the moment my name was revealed, my father's face draining of blood as I announced my ownership of his empire. The cameras had caught every detail, the tightening of his jaw, Evelyn's trembling hand, Celeste frozen in disbelief. For the first time in decades, Gerald Whitmore looked small, and the world savored it. Reporters swarmed me in the days that followed, and though I gave only carefully measured statements, the image had already crystallized in the public imagination. They saw me as a woman cast out, scorned, erased, who had returned not just standing but triumphant. They wrote about resilience, about vengeance turned to power, about a dynasty crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. Book sales under the Raven Montgomery name exploded, tripling overnight. Readers who had whispered to me in private messages now shouted their support publicly, connecting my novels with the real story of my life. "She's not just writing about strength," one magazine declared. "She is living it." Meanwhile, the Whitmore Hotel Group began to collapse in real time. Investors fled, unwilling to stand beside a patriarch exposed as both cruel and incompetent. Partners demanded answers, and the board scrambled to contain the damage, only to discover that I was no longer in the shadows, I was the shadow. My holding companies had spread like roots beneath their feet, quiet and unseen until the moment they tightened. One property after another slipped from his grasp, every acquisition perfectly legal, every document airtight. Gerald raged in private, but in public he could do nothing but watch as his empire was dismantled by the daughter he had tried to erase. The media hounded him relentlessly. Old allies turned their backs, unwilling to risk their own reputations. His phone calls went unanswered, invitations disappeared. The man who once commanded boardrooms now found doors closing in his face. Evelyn fared no better. Her polished charm withered under the spotlight, her whispers finally exposed as poison. Society women who once hung on her every word now crossed the street to avoid her. The Monroes, once untouchable in Boston, began to fracture under the weight of her schemes. Lucas, to his credit, refused to leave my side, and the more Evelyn pushed, the more he pulled away. Celeste clung desperately to her image, attending charity events, smiling for cameras, pretending nothing had changed, but the cracks showed. Questions followed her everywhere. What did you know? Were you complicit? How could you stand by while your sister was erased? Her perfect mask began to falter, and the envy she had always hidden leaked out in every brittle laugh, every tight smile. She was no longer the golden child, she was the sister who had stayed silent while I was buried alive. For me, the storm was both relentless and liberating. I gave interviews on my terms, spoke of resilience rather than revenge, framed my story not as bitterness but as rebirth. Sometimes, I told a reporter on national television, being cast out is the greatest gift. It forces you to stop begging for a seat at their table and build your own instead. The clip went viral, replayed millions of times, quoted by women who had lived their own smaller versions of my story. I became more than a scandal, I became a symbol. But behind the calm answers and practiced poise, fire still burned. I hadn't just come to the surface to breathe. I had risen to take the air from their lungs. The Whitmores had built their empire on arrogance, cruelty, and control. Evelyn had tried to strangle me with whispers. Celeste had smirked while I was erased. And my father had looked me in the eye and told me I was nothing. Now I stood where they had once stood, and I would not be merciful. Every morning, new headlines announced another fracture in their world. Federal regulators began sniffing around the Whitmore Foundation's finances, questioning how donations were managed, whether funds had been misused. Whispers of fraud emerged, stories of creative accounting and shady partnerships. Evelyn's name was dragged into the reports, her pearls suddenly a chain around her neck. Gerald tried to silence it with lawyers, but even their influence couldn't stop the tide. Anonymous tips fed reporters, leaks appeared at convenient moments, and though I never confirmed or denied, I knew where the information came from. When you've been buried, you learn where all the skeletons lie. One night, sitting in my penthouse with the city spread beneath me, I watched a news anchor summarize it all. The Whitmore dynasty, once untouchable, is crumbling under scandal and betrayal. Meanwhile, Raven Montgomery, revealed to be Eleanor Whitmore, has become one of the most influential voices of resilience in the country. I looked at my reflection in the glass, the city lights flickering in my eyes, and for the first time I believed it. I wasn't just surviving. I was rewriting the story. Gerald called me once, weeks after the gala. His voice was raw, stripped of its booming authority. "Eleanor," he said, and I almost didn't recognize the sound of my own name in his mouth. "You've made your point. You've humiliated me. But this is family. Can't we?" I cut him off. "Family?" My laugh was sharp, bitter. "Family is what you erased when you told me I was nothing. This is business. And in business, I own you." I hung up, my hands steady, my heart unflinching. For the first time, the man who once controlled my every move had no control at all. By summer, the Whitmore Hotel Group was no longer his. The board voted him out, forced into retirement, his name stripped from the empire he had built. Evelyn retreated from public life, her reputation in tatters, her circle scattered. Celeste, exposed and powerless, married her attorney fiancé in a ceremony so subdued it was almost pitiful, her smile brittle in every photograph. And me. Raven Montgomery soared. Book deals multiplied, speaking engagements filled my calendar, and investments flourished under my hand. I had become everything they told me I could never be. But the sweetest part wasn't the money, the fame, or even the power. It was the silence. The silence of a world that once told me I was nothing, now unable to say my name without respect. I thought of that night at the Thanksgiving table, the laughter, the chandeliers, my father's voice cutting through me like glass. I thought of the girl who stumbled out into the cold Charleston night, erased and alone. And I knew she was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had been forged in fire, who had risen not in spite of their cruelty but because of it. I was no longer begging for a place at their table. I had built my own, and the world was already seated. The storm that began with whispers swelled into a full investigation. The Whitmore Foundation, once paraded as a shining beacon of charity, came under federal scrutiny. Headlines blared about mismanaged funds, about donors misled, about millions diverted into consulting contracts that seemed to benefit only the Whitmores themselves. Reporters combed through documents, piecing together a mosaic of greed, and suddenly the philanthropic crown Gerald and Evelyn had flaunted glittered no more. It was tarnished, cracked, and dripping with rot. The ballroom scandal had cracked the veneer, but the investigations smashed it to pieces. Agents were photographed arriving at Whitmore Properties, briefcases in hand, faces grim. The image of black SUVs parked outside the family estate ran on front pages across the country. Gerald's protests sounded desperate now, no longer authoritative but petulant, the voice of a man who knew he was losing everything. Evelyn was summoned to testify, pearls still strung tight against her throat but her hands trembling as she swore under oath. The society queen who once controlled rooms with a glance now stammered through half-truths and evasions. Every word made her smaller. Celeste tried to maintain her composure, still attending galas, still flashing that perfect smile, but reporters hounded her with questions. Did you know? Were you involved? Did you help cover up the fraud? Her carefully curated facade began to crack. Sponsors pulled away from her projects, whispers spread that she was toxic, that anyone aligned with her was aligning with corruption. She had spent years bathing in admiration, and now the spotlight seared her skin. Meanwhile, I moved like a ghost through the chaos, untouchable. The name Raven Montgomery appeared in every paper, not just as a best-selling author but now as a symbol of accountability. Magazines ran profiles, the woman who rose from ashes. Bookstores displayed my novels with signs quoting my real story, exiled heiress. Self-made powerhouse. Every appearance I made was dissected, every word carried as if it were prophecy. And behind it all, my investments continued to grow, tightening their grip on the empire that had once spit me out. I didn't revel in every detail of their suffering, not openly. But alone, I allowed myself to savor the irony. The family that once told me I was nothing now defined itself by its failure, and my name was woven into every story of their collapse. I thought of Gerald, roaring at the head of that long mahogany table, declaring me erased. I wondered if he remembered those words when he sat alone in his study, phone silent, empire crumbling. I wondered if Evelyn, with all her whispered sabotage, realized that in trying to suffocate me, she had only sharpened my claws. The deeper the investigations went, the more allies they lost. Business partners severed contracts. Banks froze accounts. Charities quietly scrubbed their names from donor walls. The Whitmore crest, once a seal of power, now drew only suspicion. Even Lucas's estranged cousins in Boston began distancing themselves from Evelyn, muttering apologies, claiming they had never approved of her cruelty. It was too late. The stain had spread. One evening, Lucas came home with news. "Your father's been forced off the board entirely," he said, his voice low but steady. The vote was unanimous. I nodded, my expression calm, but inside I felt the final chain snap. Gerald Whitmore, the man who had built an empire and crowned himself untouchable, was finished. He had been dethroned not by rivals, not by the market, but by the daughter he had discarded. He called me again, one last time. His voice was hoarse, almost broken. "Eleanor," he said, "please. You've won. What more do you want from me?" I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly, and whispered back, "I don't want anything from you. I never did. That's what you never understood." I ended the call, and with it, any remaining thread that tied me to him. Evelyn's fall was slower, more humiliating. Invitations to luncheons disappeared, her name struck from committees she once ruled. Friends stopped answering her calls. I even heard that one afternoon, walking through Boston's shopping district, she was ignored entirely by women who used to cling to her every word. For Evelyn Monroe, silence was worse than hatred. She faded into the background of the world she once commanded. And me. I didn't just survive. I soared. Raven Montgomery was no longer just a pseudonym, it was an empire. Book contracts turned into film options, speaking engagements drew thousands, and my words reached women who whispered to me that my story had saved them, that they had found strength in my survival. I became not just a figure in society but a voice in culture. Yet at night, when the applause and headlines quieted, I would sit by the window of my penthouse and stare out at the glittering city. The girl who once stood shivering in the Charleston night, told she was nothing, still lived somewhere inside me. I thought of her often, of her hollow eyes in the mirror, her trembling hands clutching a phone that rang with rejection. I wanted to tell her she would make it, that one day she would walk into a ballroom not as a ghost but as a storm. By the end of the year, the Whitmore name was no longer synonymous with power but with ruin. Gerald lived quietly in exile, his health failing, his pride shattered. Evelyn retreated entirely, her pearls gathering dust in a locked drawer. Celeste still clung to relevance, but no one listened the way they once had. Their empire was gone. Their legacy dissolved. And me. I stood taller than I ever imagined. Not because I had destroyed them, though I had, but because I had rebuilt myself from the ashes of their cruelty. I had carved out a place in the world not by inheritance, not by permission, but by sheer will. I was young, strong, and unbreakable. I was Raven Montgomery. And I was finally, irrevocably free. By the time autumn painted the city in gold, the Whitmore dynasty was nothing but an echo. Newspapers that once courted my father's quotes now chronicled his disgrace with clinical precision. Former tycoon retreats after board ouster. Whitmore name tied to federal probe. No one spoke of Gerald Whitmore with reverence anymore, only with a mixture of disbelief and pity. Evelyn had disappeared from public life entirely. Her pearls, her luncheons, her razor-sharp whispers, all gone. Celeste clung to the scraps of her image, posting staged photographs, flashing brittle smiles at dwindling audiences. But she was a shadow now, her light eclipsed. I, on the other hand, had never burned brighter. Raven Montgomery was more than a best-selling author, she had become a cultural phenomenon. My books topped charts around the world, translated into dozens of languages. Readers who had never heard of the Whitmores saw themselves in my stories of women rising from betrayal, carving power out of pain. My speaking tours sold out theaters. Magazines printed my face with headlines like The Phoenix Heiress and The Woman Who Built Her Own Empire. But I wasn't content with applause. I wanted permanence. I wanted to take the word legacy that Gerald had weaponized against me and redefine it on my own terms. That winter, I launched the Montgomery Foundation. Its mission was simple yet radical, to provide grants and mentorship for women rebuilding their lives after estrangement, abuse, or public shaming. The Women's Society labeled as failures, as unworthy, as erased, they would be given tools to rise. I poured millions into it, not as charity but as investment in resilience. At the opening gala, held in a hall brighter than any Whitmore had ever built, I stood before an audience of hundreds and declared, legacy is not about bloodlines. It's about impact. It's about who you lift as you rise. The applause shook the walls, echoing like thunder. The press covered it relentlessly. They contrasted my foundation with the Whitmore Foundation scandals, my transparency with their deceit, my empowerment with their elitism. Overnight, I wasn't just an author or an investor. I was a leader, a voice reshaping what power looked like. Lucas stood beside me through it all, his quiet strength grounding me. Evelyn had tried to break us, but her sabotage had only welded us closer. He told me once, late at night as we lay in bed, you don't even realize it, do you? You've become the thing they always claimed to be. You're what legacy actually means. I kissed him, my heart steady for the first time in years, knowing he was right. Still, I couldn't ignore the ghosts. One evening, after a particularly powerful speech, I returned to my penthouse and stood at the window, the city a constellation at my feet. I thought of that Thanksgiving night again, the chandeliers, the laughter, my father's voice cutting me down. I remembered walking into the cold Charleston night with nothing but shame clinging to me. That girl had believed she was finished. She had believed her story ended at the front gates of her family estate. But she had been wrong. That girl had become the spark that ignited Raven Montgomery. I received one final letter from Gerald before the end. It wasn't grand or threatening. It wasn't even bitter. It was simply desperate. The handwriting was shaky, the words uneven. I wanted to build a legacy. I see now I destroyed it. You've built something greater. I only hope one day you might forgive me. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and left it there. Forgiveness was not mine to give, not anymore. My life had moved beyond him, beyond all of them. The world knew my name now, not as Eleanor Whitmore, the forgotten daughter, but as Raven Montgomery, the woman who could not be erased. Women wrote to me from every corner of the globe, letters, emails, messages, telling me that my story had given them courage to leave abusive marriages, to start businesses, to reclaim their own voices. My legacy wasn't just money or fame. It was the ripple I had created, the fire that spread into others' lives. And so, when I walked onto the stage at the Global Women's Summit that following spring, introduced as a keynote speaker, I felt the weight of it fully. The crowd rose in ovation before I even spoke. Lights flashed, cameras rolled, but all I saw were the faces of women who had lived their own battles. I raised my head, young, unbroken, fierce, and began. Once, I was told I was nothing. Once, I was erased. But sometimes, the worst words you ever hear are the ones that free you. I stopped begging for a seat at their table. I built my own. And you can too. The hall thundered with applause. In that moment, I knew the truth. Gerald's dynasty was gone, Evelyn's whispers silenced, Celeste's crown shattered. My story had swallowed theirs whole. I had taken everything they tried to deny me and turned it into something immortal. I was not their legacy. I was my own.